In the last segment, I was talking about the sort of economy, the affluent economy of the 1920s in the United States. It wasn't necessarily true around the globe, but we'll be talking more about some of the economics of the 1920s internationally as they affect the United States. In this lecture, my primary interest is on the domestic side and what was happening sort of within the United States to create what was truly a genuinely unique, I think, decade in American history, the 1920s. So again, we're talking about the Jazz Age, and I've talked a bit about the politics, and I've talked a bit about this economy of the so-called roaring 1920s. But the 1920s weren't simply called roaring because of this massive sort of economic expansion that was taking place. They were roaring in part because of the sort of cultural release that occurred after the First World War, and it manifested itself in the 1920s. There are a number of different ways of looking at this cultural episode in American history. One way might be to consider it a sort of contest between a new cultural way of looking at the world and more traditional values. Some historians, literary types, scholars have looked at the decade in very much that way. It seems to me it's a bit more complicated, and part of what complicates the cultural story is the story of technology, but it's also the story of the economics of the era. And so before we're finished, I hope to bring all of that together. But in this segment, I really want to focus in on the cultural side and what was happening in the 1920s to make them roaring. We refer during the Jazz Age to the so-called lost generation. And it's a term that really comes from the decade itself, and especially from literature, which I'll talk more about in just a few minutes. But the notion of the lost generation, I think, refers back to a generation, first of all, that is affected by the terrors and the horrors of the First World War. Comparatively, compared to other European powers, or to European powers, the United States, in terms of losses, fairly minimal during the First World War. We got in late and fairly close to the end of the war. But casualties and deaths alone don't necessarily reflect the impact that the experience of war could have on a population of veterans returning to the United States and to those who experienced it. The second factor, I think, in thinking about this lost generation as a term has to do with the abandonment, if you will, of sort of traditional mores and values. By traditional, what I really mean, and I need to be more clear here, I suspect, but I'm referring back to sort of those mores, those values, those morals that emerged for society out of the Victorian era, the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century. What's appropriate and what's not, and notions of very defined gender roles, what it's appropriate for a lady to do, or a girl to do, or a young man to do, or a middle-class male to do. All that's tied up and bound up in these sort of social and cultural definitions of gender and class. Those foundations, whatever we may think of them, by the 1920s, in part because of the war, are really coming up for considerable scrutiny and reconsideration. And it's, I think, particularly true of the young. And so I really want to focus predominantly on the young or youth during this period. But I want to start with the effect on, say, women and gender in particular. You may recall that in 1920, in the United States, women had finally gotten a national recognition in the Constitution of their right to suffrage, the right to the vote. And that had come through the 19th, or the so-called Susan B. Anthony Amendment to the Constitution. But again, political rights without the economic underpinnings that allow for independence can in some ways be meaningless. Maybe not meaningless, political rights matter, but their value can be affected by the ability of the person who wants to use those rights, the ability of that person to make their own way in the world, and therefore to be independent in the expression of their political rights. For women, the right to vote that was assured through this amendment and assured nationally is an expression of a desire for a say over their lives. It's a desire for power. But it doesn't answer certain political questions like, would women by and large participate in the existing parties, Democrat, Republican, Progressive, Socialist, or would it behoove women to consider voting as a sort of gender bloc? Would they need to formulate their own parties, separate women's party, if you will? Well, the 1920 election, though it's right on the heels of ratification of the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, the 1920 election helps begin to answer these questions. And it doesn't take long before politically women are wrapped up in the sort of cultural expressions, the cultural atmosphere of the 1920s. And at least it seems many of the overriding political questions for women are sort of left behind. Certainly not by all women, but by many. There are other questions that seem to take precedence. And that's why I think it's fair to say that by and large, women ended up voting much as their husbands or fathers voted. And that was certainly the case in 1920. And we know from the previous segments that there had been Harding victory, of course, followed by Coolidge victory. And there was no real development of a specific women's party or women's voting bloc. Women divided much as men divided over issues. Where women did, I think, begin to express themselves in the 20s was not necessarily just politically or primarily politically, but it was in asserting the practical economics of everyday life and asserting their cultural privilege as women. And what I mean by that, you may recall that women had taken on new roles during the First World War. They had expanded old roles in terms of their place in the labor force. They had moved into offices. They had moved into new industries. They had served as nurses in so many different ways that, again, we've sort of already talked about. But in the 1920s, women aren't necessarily ready to give up those newly won and hard-won positions. And so you see more women, for instance, working in industries like cosmetics, and cosmetics become very important in the 1920s, in fashion, in publishing, in offices, working as clerks and secretaries, and in education. So the expanded opportunities for women that come out of the First World War are in some instances retained by women, and they hold and even expand those positions during the 1920s. That's an expression of economic power, but it's also an expression of cultural power, power to move beyond designated roles of gender. But here's the thing, and I think this is worth noting. These expressions of women's power are in the 1920s bound up with the economics of the decade. And what that means for me anyway is they are bound up oftentimes with changing ideas in the United States about consumption. In the economics segment, when I talked with you about economics, one of the things I spoke a little bit about, but perhaps should have emphasized more, was the degree to which the 1920s economy was indeed a consumer economy. We talked about automobiles and we talked about appliances. Leisure is something equally well to be consumed during this era. But one of the great shifts in American history that I think is so evident in the 1920s, it's not just cultural, though that's part of it. And this is, in fact, a little bit of a sort of cultural point. But one of the great shifts in American history that you see in the 20s, but it starts before. It starts back with Henry Ford and the Model T and mass production, is the necessity for mass consumption. Well, we talked a bit about that with World War I, but understand that this desire to have an automobile is fueled by advertising, and we talked about that earlier when talking about the new economy. I think the emphasis on advertising reflects this desire for consumption. And so if women are working in cosmetics, part of that has to do with a new desire to consume these kind of aesthetic things like cosmetics by the American people. I mentioned advertisements, for instance, for things like Listerine, basic necessities that we take for granted today, like deodorant, Listerine, stuff like that, dental hygiene stuff. They weren't considered necessities before the 1920s, but there's a true revolution that's occurring in the 19-teens, and then you see it full-blown in the 1920s. That's driven by marketing and leading people to consume. So some of these job openings for women come in terms of this new consumption. It's the result of the new consumption. But similarly, part of the rationale for women focusing on economics, much as with men, I don't mean to be gender biased here, but it has to do with working, valuing as a result of work, not restraint and not saving so much as obtaining material goods or consumption. And I would argue that one of the reasons you see a shift in emphasis, of course, part of the reason here is you've achieved the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. You've achieved the 19th Amendment. So you've achieved that sort of long-term goal of political rights. But at the same time, I think some of the turning away from an emphasis on political rights in the 1920s is reflective of the new emphasis on the new culture, and it's a culture of consumption. I hope that's made some sense. It's a little complicated, and maybe I haven't done the best job of it, but those elements are bound together in the 20s, and they have to do then with sort of this new emergent culture of the 20s that's often cast against the traditional culture that preceded it. Now, I started out talking about this notion of the lost generation. And I want to stick with women's issues just very briefly and suggest that one of the concerns of the teens and then into the 1920s for women beyond the politics of the vote and the power of the vote had to do with no less an issue than birth control. And birth control carries with it a great deal of cultural baggage. Maybe that's not the best word, but certainly cultural importance. Because at its heart, the notion of birth control carries with it the idea that a woman ought to be able to control her own body. And I need you to understand that for much of American history, that notion would have been absurd. It was the common experience for women that upon marriage, for instance, their property became the property of their husband. Very seldom could women, except in specific positions, for instance, widowhood, operate without or operate legally in terms of property or the ownership of property, the sale of property. Even when it came to their own children, very seldom could they operate without a male presence to take care of the paperwork and the official documents. Birth control, then, is not merely about the control of reproduction biologically. It carries with it that cultural significance that women should have the say or a right over their own bodies. Now, the reason I bring this up is that during the 19-teens and certainly into the 1920s, the issue of birth control for women would become an important issue for sort of continued reform work. Margaret Sanger is one of the key figures that pushed or pressed this work forward, arguing, especially when it came to the lower classes, that childbearing and child rearing for women was one of those issues that ultimately added to the general state of want and poverty. Not unlike, in some respects, not unlike alcohol had done, or would continue to do, really, even with prohibition, right? The old prohibition fight to limit alcohol and stop things like domestic abuse, etc. Well, one of the arguments that's being made is that, in particular, the poor are suffering from large families and many mouths to feed. And so to give women an opportunity to excel, to grow and develop, one of the things that had to be dealt with was family size and the impact of childbearing, for instance, on women. Often families could be quite large, and there was often to be health repercussions for women who bore many children over a limited space of time. It's also generally quite dangerous, of course, to bear children. But this business of birth control is just one more example, I think, of the cultural battles and the social sort of conflicts that will be part of the 1920s and will question the traditions, the established traditions of society in the United States and internationally as well. But birth control also leads us into really another point connected back to advertising in the 20s and stuff, but that's the point of sexuality. The lost generation, and again, it's tied to cultural ideas about gender, but the lost generation will really experience sort of sex in ways that their parents and grandparents hadn't done. Now, attitudes over the course of human history regarding sexuality have changed greatly over time. And they're different in different parts of the world and different parts of the United States. But remember, again, we're talking about sort of these Victorian notions of what is appropriate for a young lady, what's appropriate for a young man. And the attitudes are generally quite, I'll use the term, quite repressive. In other words, there's a very strict time for this and a very strict time for this. And if you engage in, for instance, sex outside those particular times in life, then you're breaking the norm. You're sort of entering the world of taboo. But by the 1920s, in the wake of World War I, many of these taboos are seriously being questioned. The larger term, the jazz age, is tied, of course, to the music. There's no way around that. But again, it's the cultural baggage that we're really talking about. Because jazz, as a musical form, is connected very much to African American rhythms and emerges from African American communities in places like New Orleans, where you have ragtime, up and down the Mississippi, ultimately spreading to Chicago and New York and further. But it's very much connected with African Americans, and it's very much connected with clubs and alcohol in an age of prohibition. Just as early on in the 20th century, ragtime and Dixieland jazz were connected with the red light or the vice districts of places like New Orleans and Memphis. Well, imagine for a moment the shift in society when young ladies, young women, began to frequent speakeasies where jazz is being played. They began to frequent clubs. It's not just the music, that's bad enough, but it's also what's going on in those clubs. It's the alcohol, it's the dancing, it's the rhythms that were understood to be highly sexually charged. One of the sort of larger understandings of American history is the connection between race and sexuality, but highly, highly sexually charged. These young women moved beyond just changes in fashion. And I often, when talking with students and lecturing, when we talk about the changes occurring for women, it is this new sort of independence that's being expressed. A new independence. It's expressed through the automobile. And I've got an ad, which I may have told you about, but I'll mention it again. And it's an ad by Ford Motor Company, really trying to pique the interest of women in purchasing cars, because the car is a mode of increased independence. If you have a car, you can drive yourself. You're one of these new women. And you have a place in the world. And if you get a car, that's going to make you able to enjoy the rights and privileges that are yours. Granted, you'll have to pay on time or get your husband to pay on time, and you're going to go into debt. But that new car as a symbol is a symbol of independence. It's always kind of been that way in the United States. Similarly, fashion plays a huge role in the early decades of the 20th century. We can talk about the Gibson girl, but the Gibson girl is that notion of the long skirt, kind of curvaceous with the waist drawn in. And we talk about the shirt waist as a type of blouse that draws in the waist. So you've got a long flowing skirt all the way down to the feet and the ankles. Usually very long hair that is put up in a bun under a hat. Or could be worn up in a bun but shown long. It was not to be let down in public. That was for the privacy of the bedroom or the home. By the early 1920s, fashion is already shifting. You can see hemlines rising so that the hemlines begin to move up over the ankle and up toward the calf. You can also see the lines of women's fashion in particular beginning to change. And I think it's most apparent in women's fashion. But for instance, the curved lines of the Gibson girl, this sort of petite, young, but womanly girl figure, those lines are replaced by the straighter lines, almost boyish or androgynous lines of the newer fashion that we see already, again, by the early 1920s. One other feature that would come to sort of define or identify the so-called flapper. And a flapper was often, again, a young girl who espoused these ideals of freedom, greater liberalism, questioning of the old standards for youth and female youth behavior in particular. But the flapper was identified with jazz, with cars, cruising around. Another indicator for the flapper is bobbed hair. And that basically means clipped hair. And one of my favorite all-time stories, in fact, is a story by F. Scott Fitzgerald. We'll talk about him in just a bit. But F. Scott Fitzgerald writing about the 20s, and it's a story called Bernice Bobs Her Hair. And I think it's just a wonderful story about this tension that existed in the 1920s over something as simple as hairstyles and what those hairstyles said, what their cultural importance was. But for a young lady to cut her hair was to make a statement that she was a flapper, that she was participating, at least wanted to participate, in this ideal of the new independent woman free of the old constraints and restrictions. But in particular here, talking about youth. Okay? So it's not just women, it's young men as well. And indeed, I think it's really in the 1920s that we first see the emergence of this notion of sort of adolescence, that we first see the emergence of the notion that there is a separate period between childhood and adulthood where you have youth, not quite grown up, but no longer a child. That's very much tied to consumption. And here's sort of how. I often think anyway, because I have children, and I know how advertisers reach out to children to make purchases or get their parents to make purchases on their behalf. I mean, everything from cartoons with their commercials to cereal boxes with their free offers, which are not so free really. You start thinking about how marketers identify particular groups. Then think about the 1920s and this creation, if you will, of a new age, a new era in the life cycle that allows marketers to reach out to people based on that in-between state, neither child nor fully adult. Fashion is one of those areas where I think the appeal to consumption could be strongest, because both bobbing of the hair and what fashions one chose to wear, which was something now that middle-class Americans could begin to do as they never had before in this affluent economy. You know, the wealthy, Marie Antoinette, for instance, always been about fashion. The aristocrats of Europe, always about fashion. But now we're really talking about middle-class Americans thinking about fashion, the youth or young people, children of lawyers, doctors, managers, business people. Hemlines during the 1920s continue to go up. They continue to rise until, they're well above the knee, off the shoulder, until young women who are doing these jazz-related kind of dances, are doing so in what would, by Victorian standards, be considered basically a state of undress, as if, they were in their undergarments. So this creation of youth culture is bound up with the economy, is bound up with consumption, the business of America's business, but it's also bound up with the cultural shift. And I guess the point I'm really trying to make, and it's not an easy point, it's something I struggle with too, understanding the 20s and what's happening in America. I just need you to understand how these elements are all bound up in this decade in a way that I think is just absolutely amazing. And it's partly amazing because it shapes so much of what we are today in the United States. It shouldn't surprise you that in the new atmosphere of the 1920s, we began to see, among other things, divorce rates begin to skyrocket. Divorce had been very much looked down upon, very much denied. But in the new conditions of the 20s, you have divorce rates going up. You also have unwanted pregnancy rates going up considerably. As young people began to use the automobile, that mechanism of independence to date, outside of the immediate care or oversight of adults. It didn't happen all at once. It didn't happen for all adolescents, but it began to happen for many more. As college becomes more important for education, you have kids going off and they have access to money, they have access to leisure. It also shouldn't surprise you, I suppose, that college is something to be consumed. And you can see that in part in the growth of spectator sports. College sports is just a grand example in the 1920s as we move into the era of big-time college sports. It's one example of this growing consumption. These sports are intended to be spectator sports, but it also helps explain some of the sports hero worship that becomes part of 1920s lore. People like Babe Ruth become household names, celebrities. Again, in college sports, you have people like Red Grange, and you'll have teams like Notre Dame emerging to sort of national acclaim for their achievements, especially in things like football, college football. You have fraternities and sororities emerging on campus with their own sort of youth culture. One of the big things to do was to swallow goldfish. I don't know why. I've never understood that, but it's just like one of the things you do to identify in a mass culture sort of way with this larger group, this larger entity, this youth culture. Raccoon skin coats became the fad in the 1920s. Pole sitting and record breaking and heavy petting, one of those kind of identifying characteristics of the 20s and college and so on. I could easily leave you with the impression that this business of the jazz age and the roaring 20s in a cultural sense, especially for the young, is predominantly a matter of sort of petty concern, right? It's, that their major issues, their major interests are sort of laughable and humorous and certainly not serious. But I think that wouldn't be quite the correct taste of the 20s to leave you with. Because I also want to make sure you understand that the 20s, in terms of that independence and that sort of liberation that occurs, opens the door in the very midst of the tension for a great, great deal of creativity. In fact, and it's just one opinion, but I've often been drawn to much of the literature and the music produced in the United States in the 1920s, as well as we might throw in the art that's produced. The sort of contemporary art where abstraction itself is becoming a statement as people struggle to understand this world of becoming, of constant change, where the things you might have depended on socially in terms of custom are no longer something you can depend upon without question. Some of the greatest writers of the era, many of them had gone to Europe, at least briefly. Ernest Hemingway comes to mind as one of the lost generation's expatriates who decided that the place to experience life was in Paris, away from the United States, on the continent. Just a number of different authors come to mind. In the United States, two particularly I just leave you with. One is F. Scott Fitzgerald, who, of course, wrote The Great Gatsby. And in many ways, with books like This Side of Paradise, became a sort of chronicler of the craziness of the jazz age, what's the word I'm looking for here? Not craziness exactly, but the excess of the jazz age, but also the pain that went along with it. Some really, really amazing stories, partly drawn from his own sort of torrid alcoholic life with his wife Zelda. William Faulkner really makes his start in the 1920s, and a lot of people don't care for Faulkner. I really do have a great appreciation for William Faulkner's work. Eugene O'Neill, Sinclair Lewis comes to mind, Harry Miller, and another figure really pushing boundaries coming out of the 1920s and that whole milieu. But it's not just, of course, white literati. You also have people like Langston Hughes, because the expression of the 1920s will also impact African Americans. As just another example of another group, where you have in Harlem, for instance, in Chicago, out of New Orleans, through jazz certainly, but also in literature and also in the arts, this just magnificent new expression of understanding of what the liberation of the 20s could potentially mean for oneself as an African American. Women writers. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. And we don't really have time, I guess, to go into a literary lecture here, and I'm pretty sure you wouldn't want me to if I could. But I mean, names like Langston Hughes that I've mentioned, Countee Cullen, James Weldon Johnson, and so on. What these authors were often doing, well, one, I think they were relating a certain level of cynicism. It's not just hope and possibility in the 1920s, but I think you could almost argue that some of that liberation, some of that hope and possibility was couched or based on the cynicism that emerges from the First World War. In other words, if the old men are going to lead us into death, destruction, finality, perhaps we ought to stop and ask exactly who put the old men in charge. Who put that generation in charge? Who left them to make decisions that cost millions their lives? So it's not as if I can tell you that the Jazz Age is one thing. It's not. As with most things historical, the Jazz Age, the 1920s, represent a period in flux and in tension. And what the historian seeks to do is to try and come to terms with the sides, with the facets, the various facets of a thing. And it's not always easy, but it's definitely worthwhile.